I've butchered that. We're going to get started, I think. My name is Dr. Trevelyan Wing. I'm a fellow at the Center for Geopolitics here at the University of Cambridge. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here today on behalf of both my center and the Scott Polar Research Institute to this timely event on the geopolitics of Greenland, past, present, and future. We are joined today by an exceptional panel of experts participating both here and virtually, including from Greenland, who I'm especially delighted to welcome. US President Donald J. Trump's recent comments about acquiring Greenland, or Kalaallit Nunaat, as again they say in Greenlandic, have once more placed this geostrategically significant island, the world's largest, on the proverbial map. Situated between Europe and North America, the self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark commands the gateway to the Arctic and two important shipping routes, the fabled Northwest Passage and Transpolar Sea Route, which are expected to open by mid-century thanks to climate change. Outside interest in Greenland, however, is not new, with the Truman administration having offered Denmark $100 million to buy the island in 1946. Denmark, of course, turned that down. An agreement signed in 1941, meanwhile, gave the US the right to construct military bases there, and it played a vital role during the Cold War in America's missile early warning system. Now, with the increasing accessibility of rich new mineral, hydrocarbon, and other resources under and around the Greenland ice sheet and surrounding waters, set against a backdrop, of course, of accelerating climate change, great power competition, and rising geopolitical tensions, this large island at the top of the world has captured the attention of superpowers and diverse other players both near and far. However, the Greenlanders themselves remain determined to shape their own future and have called snap elections for March 11th. It is all the more vital then, here today, that we position their perspectives front and center, and I'm especially delighted to welcome those here this evening. Now, without further ado, let me welcome our first speaker, Professor of Arctic Studies and Director of the Scott Polar Research Institute, Richard Powell. Professor Powell, you have the floor. Thanks very much again for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction and invitation. Thank you all for coming. It's a really timely moment to talk about these issues, and I'm really looking forward to hearing my colleagues on the panel's thoughts and questions as well. So I thought I'd start by saying that about 10 years ago, I published a paper that I first gave in Oxford at what was being then termed the Oxford Arctic Conference. And the paper I gave was about Greenland's place in what at that time was being envisaged as the new North American Arctic. And I argued then that Greenland was always being framed from the outside as a desirable and critically strategic place because of its perceived resources and its perceived navigational, military, and security significance. And this hasn't changed, and it's always worth remembering that, I think, when we talk about the past, present, and future of the geopolitics of Greenland. And moreover, Greenland's long-awaited foreign security and defence policy and Arctic Strategy 2024-2033, which was published last year, is literally titled Greenland in the World, Nothing About Us Without Us. And I'm sure many of you know that, and making a joke about that is just too obvious. But it's the context for this and the aggrandizing rhetoric about the future of the island by outsiders is something that Greenlanders and the Naalakkersuisut, or government of Greenland, have long been acutely aware. So the point about the framing of Greenland's resources and future was evident from the earliest Danish royal expeditions in search of the Norse, or in search of the traces of the Norse in 1605 and 1606, and then the more systematic attempts led by the Lutheran missionary Hans Egil on behalf of Frederick IV from 1721. And in terms of Danish ownership of Greenland, the story goes that 10 years after those first missions had been established in 1731, the new king there, or the then new king, Christian VI, wanted to withdraw from Greenland, but Hans Egil persuaded him otherwise by appealing to his conscience about the need to not to abandon these new kind of evangelized royal subjects. And arguably ever since, no Danish leader has ever seriously contemplated withdrawing from Greenland or giving up Greenland, at least not until Greenlanders specifically request it. And that gives a sense of how deeply embedded the idea of, or the connection between Greenland and Denmark is in the Danish psyche and national identity. And only recently, more generally in Denmark, there begun to be an understanding of those legacies as a more colonial relationship. And it's been facilitated by home rule since 1979 and self-rule since 2009. And as you just mentioned, the principle that Greenland can initiate plans for independence from the Kingdom of Denmark once it feels it has the economic means are now acknowledged within the text of the self-rule agreement. So getting this or understanding Greenland, I think, really requires an understanding of history. And so President Trump's recent claims, admittedly when being asked by reporters impromptu press conferences, but the claim that there are only about 45,000 people who live there and nobody really knows why Denmark owns it, show a shocking lack of demographic and historical knowledge. I was actually thinking, because I often obviously lecture about this, and I always used to say, it's 56,000. I'm sure it's 57,000. So I actually went and checked, and according to Statistics Greenland, the 2024 population is 56,699. But it just shows how even the moment of sort of declaration makes you sometimes ponder issues of fact and history, I guess. And yet, as many Greenlanders and Danes will tell you, part of the issue in the Denmark-Greenland relationship has always been about who gets to tell Greenland's history as well as its future. And however, it's also true that different American political figures have suggested that the US should purchase Greenland for about 200 years, as well as obviously Trump himself back in 2019, as you all know. That list includes the famous polar explorer Robert Peary during the Great War and President Truman back in 1946. And security has always been part of that, or part of this kind of concern, as well as access to Greenlandic minerals and resources. Now, a key component in the American perspective is the infamous Monroe Doctrine. And it's often joked that no American can tell you what the Monroe Doctrine actually is, but absolutely no American will allow it to be interfered with or watered down. But the history is, and I'm sure some of you know this, but just for specific context, on the 2nd of December 1823, President James Monroe's address to Congress suggested that the US should no longer accept European colonization of the Western Hemisphere and take actions to stop it. And then ever since, since that time in the early 1800s, up until at least the first decades of the 21st century, it was the Monroe Doctrine has been used as a sort of mantra to justify US economic, military, and security focus and expansion in the West, into the Western Hemisphere. So US interests in the Western Hemisphere. Now, until World War II, it was the Monroe Doctrine was really almost exclusively applied to the Caribbean. But then in 1941, the Denmark-US agreement for the defense of Greenland put it that, quote, the defense of Greenland against attack by a non-American power is essential to the preservation of peace and security of the American continent and of vital concern to the US, end quote. Now, it's worth noting that this agreement was during the German occupation of Denmark from April 1940, and it was allegedly signed for Denmark, on behalf of Denmark, by the Danish ambassador to the US, without the assent, and some argue even the knowledge of the king or the occupied government. And as historian, as historian Dawn Berry argues, this was significant as a unilateral action of the Roosevelt administration because it extended the Monroe Doctrine, or explicitly extended the Monroe Doctrine to Greenland for the first time. But at the same time, the key resource issue, or the key resource dimension at this point, was cryolite, which was critical in the aluminum smelting process. So during World War II, aluminium was a critical resource for aircraft. Approximately 75% of any aircraft in 1940 would be made of aluminium. And the process to create it requires bauxite to be heated and filtered, and then you require cryolite as a flux to create the aluminium. And there was only one source of cryolite in the world at the time, the Ivitut mine in southwest Greenland. And so the US occupation of Greenland during the war was precipitated by by a fear of this critically strategic mineral potentially falling into the hands of the Germans because they'd occupied Denmark, or the British who had just occupied Iceland. And effectively, from that point, the American military never left Greenland. And they've had a range of bases and activities and airstrips that have kind of moved around and been developed and things since, but that include the famous Tula Air Base or now the Pituffik Space Base in northwest Greenland. And that has always left the precise question of American recognition of Danish sovereignty hanging over the decades. And there have been periodic controversies around this, such as over nuclear weapons, testing, CIA rendition flights, mining of uranium, etc., etc. So over the past decade or so, though, the US and NATO have become anxious over increasing Russian and Chinese naval and economic activity in Greenland. Greenland supposedly holds some of the last rare earth elements and critical minerals needed for military, digital, smart, and green technologies that are outside of Chinese control. So the last place supposedly that they're available is Greenland. Although, as we've been reminded over the past couple of days, there seems to be a Ukraine angle here as well. So what happens now? Well, it's very difficult to say. But as Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said in his press conference with the Danish Statsminister Mette Frederiksen, this issue, like Egger said himself, this issue didn't start yesterday, or when Trump said this, it started centuries ago. And that's likely why Egger has called the general election for the 11th of March. A couple of things to note about this in terms of the sort of Greenlandic political context is that the 31 seats in the Inatsisartut, or Parliament, are often shared closely. So you often end up with coalitions because there are only 31 seats. So you often end up needing to negotiate for a coalition to form a majority to form a government. And the other thing as well, and I was talking to students about this earlier today, is that in Greenlandic politics, particularly recent Greenlandic politics, you often call an election in order to test the public mood about a controversial issue. So there have been lots of general elections or parliamentary in our elections over the past sort of 10, 15 years, particularly since self-rule, around controversial issues. So particularly around decisions around mining, uranium, labour force for particular mines. So it's a way of trying to kind of establish a mandate. And it's also important to understand that there's very high democratic engagement in Greenland with that process compared with, North American or even European norms in terms of turnout, active participation. So people, I guess, welcome the opportunity to kind of have their democratic input into decisions. So in that context, it's not that surprising that Egil has looked to a general election to try and regain control of the narrative about Greenland's future. So I just want to finish with a couple of final historical ironies. In November 2013, during Barack Obama's second term, the then Secretary of State John Kerry announced in a speech to the Organization of the American States that the US would henceforth seek to view other states in the Americas as equals, seeking cooperation rather than adhering to doctrine. In other words, the Monroe Doctrine was over. And Trump's announcements, obviously, about Greenland and national security in relation to Greenland, but also about NAFTA, about the Panama Canal, and even NATO and the future of Europe, all suggest that for Trump, at least, the Monroe Doctrine is central to making America great again. And so you do wonder whether through this you can see there's part of this needs to be understood through the lens of Trump's psychodrama with Obama, I think. And then even more ironic, the first US president to float the idea of purchasing Greenland back in 1832 was President Andrew Jackson, a controversial figure who's been brought back to public attention in recent years precisely because he's one of Trump's heroes. There's that debate about whether the portrait of Jackson should go back into the White House and things. And arguably, you know, the story is that Trump's favorite president is Andrew Jackson, because he's the first person who tried to make America great. I mean, that's sort of crudely simplifying, but I think that's a fair simplification. So what's really tragic then is it's not really clear to me whether Trump's aware of any of those historical legacies or not, or whether he is and we don't know about it. But really, the question is still not clear to me how serious he is about intervening in Greenland's future. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for those insightful opening remarks, Professor Powell. I think that actually sets up our discussion here brilliantly. It is now my distinct honor to welcome Sara Olsvig, who serves as the International Chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, onto the floor. She was previously a member of the Danish Parliament for Greenland from 2011 to 2015, of the Greenlandic Parliament from 2013 to 2018, leader of the Inuit Ataqatigiit Party from 2014 to 2018, and Vice Premier and Minister of Social Affairs, Families, Gender Equality and Justice in the government of Greenland from 2016 to 2018. Sara, we are thrilled to welcome you here virtually from Greenland and very much look forward to your contribution. Thank you.
And thank you for the invitation to this important panel, and yet another important dialogue to take stock of the situation. And also it is my honor and pleasure to be on this panel with distinguished experts from across the sea. It's very good to see you and also others in the room. Greetings from Nuuk, Greenland. I know my colleague from the university here, Elisabeth Rasmus Leander Nielsen, is also on the call. And I think it's very important that you have included voices from here as well. Building on what Professor Powell was presenting, a lot of what was said, I could repeat as much of it was very accurate. So, Ruyanach for that. 1832 was the year that Andrew Jackson reportedly floated the idea of purchasing Greenland, to be more precise, and the interest in Greenland's resources happened up through the 1800s, and also in 1867 we see a big report published, reported back to the State Department on the resources in Greenland, Greenland, but also Iceland, which then sparked yet another discussion on possibly acquiring or annexing Greenland. So yes, it is absolutely true that the interest in Greenland is not new. And I do believe that the current administration, just like the previous one, and also the first Trump administration, have been extremely well informed of the history of the US-Greenland relations. As the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, we are an indigenous peoples organization representing Inuit in Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and Chukotka, Russia. We, as an indigenous people, have lived for millennia in our homelands, and we have seen people from the south come and go. We today live in 4 very different jurisdictions, and I think it is safe to say that Inuit in Greenland have built a self-government agreement and a constitutional arrangement that is quite unique among Inuit across the Arctic, but also unique in the world in terms of indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples' relations to the colonizer states. Our big message in our statement from Inuit Circumpolar Council is that there is no such thing as a better colonizer. And I think that reflects also the sort of the atmosphere you experience being here in Nuuk these months and weeks. It is a quite surreal atmosphere, I would say. And like we saw in 2019, the increased interest in Greenland is, of course, has a long list of ripple effects to what is being done politically, but also what is being debated among the public. I do want to correct one small thing, and that is that the election was expected. We have 4-year terms in the parliament, and the ordinary election was to take place at the latest April 6th. And since prior to the second round of attention from the U.S. administration and president, it was expected that the election would be called. And when it's called within 3 months before the latest date, which would have been April 6th again, then it's considered an ordinary election. So what I think is more important to note about the election being called is that the government the naalakkersuisut government of Gerashinet has made sure that they had some legislation in place before the election was called. I think some of us were even expecting it to be called a little bit earlier, but they made it in time to gather in the parliament to agree on a few legislative measures to ensure mitigating foreign influence on the election campaign. So, for example, how much can a foreign external funder fund the parties here in Gerashinet? They made some rules about that, and also other changes to legislation were made to ensure that external interests could not interfere or as little as possible could interfere in the election campaign. I wanted to turn to not only the history between Gerashinet and the US, but a broader concern related to the development we are seeing right now. And I think in this process of what is most likely a movement towards greater multipolarization, the big question we have to ask is whether we are seeing a change or an end, hopefully not, but a big change to the great powers, and especially the US's relation or thoughts about international rules-based order. And for us as a self-governing nation or as indigenous peoples, this, of course, is a concern that doesn't just raises our concern here and now. It is a concern that raises the question of whether the hard-won rights that we have as indigenous peoples and as peoples, including the right of self-determination, will be lost. It is definitely a thin line right now between what could be seen as a greater empowerment and, on the other hand, the loss of the hard-won rights. Any development in Greenland's political history has been guided by a determination to be self-governing, as I see it, by the people of Greenland perceiving that self-government as an inherent self-government that is exercised just by living and breathing and being here in the Arctic. And the constitutional and legislative arrangement around it are then reflective of that inherentness of the self-determination. And that's what we see in the constitutional relation between Gerashinet and Denmark. So, as the previous speaker said, I want to echo that. The big question is, are those rules-based orders and also the perception of how peoples, not just indigenous peoples, but peoples in general, have the right of self-determination to freely determine their own political future is something that will be respected. And that is, of course, I think the big question that not only naalakkersuisut are asking themselves, but also we, if I may, also as researchers, should ask ourselves. And I myself am also doing research on the area of Greenland's self-determination. Lastly, I also wanted to just remind everyone that the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration, of course, has its differences, that there's obviously big differences in approaches. But I also wanted to highlight the Biden administration's immediate attention to Greenland, to Gerashinet, as Secretary of State Blinken traveled to Gerashinet in 2021 as one of the first foreign trips, which to me was a clear demonstration of the tangible results that also came during the first Trump administration. The results including bilateral memoranda of understanding between Gerashinet, naalakkersuisut and the Trump president administration in the first term in 2019, and also a solution to what was at that time still seen as a critical issue between Gerashinet and the US in Greenland, dubbed the loss of the maintenance contract on Pituffik Space Base, a crisis that had emerged in 2014 when the US military gave the maintenance contract to a US-based company instead of a Greenlandic-Danish company, meaning that Greenland lost a significant amount of income from the base maintenance of Pituffik Space Base. And that process, I think, is extremely important to note, because the process also demonstrated how a deliberate effort was done by Gerashinet, the government of Greenland, to create a more direct relation to the US. And I think that that also demonstrates the, maybe seen from an outside perspective, blur of how one should understand the relationship between Greenland and Denmark. And I do see that as an issue also in terms of having a focus on understanding self-governing nations' different arrangements within constitutional and legislative frameworks, where Greenland's situation is quite different from what other self-governing nations we see around the world. And there has been a certain degree of blurriness in terms of the arrangement between Greenland and Denmark that might have been part of the reason of why we are seeing some of the expressed concerns from the US, the current the second Trump administration. I think I will keep it at that for now and look forward to the dialogue. But basically, it's a concerning time. It is for us. We are, as Arctic peoples, indigenous peoples, acutely aware of the Arctic significance for world geopolitics, and particularly aware of Greenland's significance to the US homeland security. And also, therefore, I think that none of these things as such are surprises. It's more of as a question of whether we can still trust that there's a respect and uphold and one upholds the international rules-based order in terms of also respecting the constitutional arrangement that the Greenland situation or the Greenlandic construction is built on. So I'll keep it at that.
Kuyanak Sara for that contribution. I think a lot of food for thought there, and I'm sure our audience and indeed the panel will want to return to many of your comments in the Q&A later. Right. Now it is my great privilege to welcome our second virtual speaker, Dr. Rasmus Leander Nielsen of the University of Greenland, where he is an associate professor and head of the Center for Foreign and Security Policy. Dr. Nielsen, we are delighted that you could join us, and also very much look forward to hearing what you have to say. Hopefully you can see and hear us all in this room.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm actually calling in from the southern part of Albania, of all places. And maybe I should just make I'm on a writing retreat trying to ignore the entire international journalist as good as I can. But I would like to start with a disclaimer. I haven't been home in Nuuk since the 22nd of December. I went on Christmas holiday in Denmark and then on a summer vacation in January in Thailand, and was quite surreal sitting on a beach in Thailand. And I think it's for us who study Greenland, Arctic studies, is a kind of a new world that I haven't really, I miss talking to Sara and to friends in Nuuk, and so I don't have a grasp of how the sentiments in Nuuk is, and also in the election campaign. But I will make, as the title goes, a few notions about the past, the present, and the future. And I was actually planning to say some of the things that's already been addressed, that this interest from the US in Greenland is nowhere new. Sara and I did a piece back in 2019, a popular science piece, where we did go back and find that report from at the time when the US bought Alaska. There was some argument that Iceland and Greenland maybe should be bought, etc. But since that have been addressed in some details already, I think I will make another comment also for you that are maybe fairly new to Greenlandic politics. and that is that if, and you sometimes even meet that argument from Danish politicians or journalists, that de jure, according to the Danish constitution of Article 19, security and foreign policy is a prerogative of Copenhagen. So sometimes when I'm doing international speeches, make the joke that my main research field of Greenlandic foreign policy is something that don't exist. However, Greenlandic foreign policies, the evolution of Greenlandic foreign policy has developed quite substantially for more than half a century. And I think that's quite important, that Greenland has developed as an international actor, has been involved in Arctic Council, in relations with the great powers, the EU, the US, has been trading with China for years, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a quite important statement to have in mind when we're discussing these things, that even though de jure foreign policy is non-existent, de facto is, in my opinion, the most interesting research field or research topic in the world, and something I think I will devote the rest of my career in trying to understand, because it is a slippery thing. There's many gray zones. When is this a Danish prerogative? When is it a Greenlandic? What is going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. So that was my short comment on the past. And then which has also been mentioned a few times already, also the present is very much the Trump deal version 2.0, but also there is an election which is not as snap as Sara stated. You could have waited a fortnight or maybe even 3 weeks, but then you would have the mayors of Greenland complaining, because 4 years ago there was a municipality election and a parliamentary election on the same date, and there's been quite some critical remarks from all the mayors in Greenland that we shouldn't do that again. So snap, yes, but maybe only a couple of weeks in terms of that. And I think what is going to be really, really interesting is also the outcome of the election, because many of the things we are discussing in terms of geopolitics, political economy, etc., could be influenced quite heavily on the outcome of the election. And to be honest, 4 years ago, I had a pretty good idea what was going to happen in terms of the outcome of the votes. And also, I actually predicted the government and also of IA, Inuit Ataqatigiit and Nalarak, and also making the argument, unfortunately, the journalists didn't quote me on that one, that maybe that wouldn't last that long. So for the last 3 years, we have a grand coalition between IEA and Siumut, who are the two biggest parties. It's very difficult to front-load the future and guessing what is going to happen. We know from comparative studies that there are costs related to being in government. There are costs related to being in a big coalition. We know that from, say, Austria and other places. My best bet so far would be a continuation of the current government, but we don't know if Siumut is going to lose a lot of votes. There are some local branches of Siumut has been quite critical about some of the fisheries laws that was made less than a year ago. Some quite vocal and well-known parliamentarians have skipped from to Nalarak, which is the main independent party. Just within the last couple of days, Vitus Reakutok, Kunufinga, etc. Some have been arguing that some of the liberal, more social liberal party, the liberal conservative parties, is going to have a progress in this. My argument is it's very difficult to predict what is actually going to happen after the election, and also some of the signals from Siumut, the main power party in Greenlandic history through time, that they are wanting to start what's called the Article 21 process of having a referendum about independence, or at least starting negotiation with the Danish government, whether that was a tactical thing to keep some of the fractions in the party outside. So there's quite a lot of unknowns in this election, and I think the outcome could be quite influential in what is going to happen in the next, moving forward within the next couple of years in terms of many of those things we have been discussing already. And then I turn to my last point, which is the future. And normally I hate when journalists ask and trying to make research that predict the future. and I won't say this is going to happen, but I will make a case of a research project that's on the verge of starting from the University of Greenland, looking into the alliance dilemmas that Greenland has, both historically, but also looking ahead what is going on. And just slightly simplifying, you could say that Greenland is mainly a dilemma between the US and China. So Greenland is selling has a substantial fisheries export to China for 2 billion Danish kroners. I forget what the current pound rate is, but you can check that up. So, and has a representation, fairly new representation in Beijing, so a small embassy, akin to a small embassy. So say Greenland isn't China. However, the US has been fairly good at phasing China out of project in Greenland for the last decade, or even a little bit more. And I think the interest from China in Greenland is going up and down. It's maybe not, the Belt and Road Initiative is not really as strong, and especially not in terms of Greenland. The only project I can see with Chinese involvement of any substantial influence is actually the most controversial mining project in Greenland, the Quanassuit claim field that Professor Powell also mentioned about the uranium case. It's actually a case of rare earth minerals because there is a Chinese company who has 10% of the stock in that. This election could also change that because the process of that mine was fairly long in the hearing process and got paused because of the election, and that Inuit Ataqatigiit won the last election and put a pause on that. And the current government has an agree to disagree clause within, and that could continue after the election. But if we see a new majority, that could start again. And then we have Chinese involvement in China, Chinese involvement in Greenland, if that project happens. So for academics like myself, that would be really, really interesting. For Greenland, maybe not as much. And I don't know how the US is going to handle that case, because there's a project that's been going on for quite a while. So what we're going to do in that project is we are in the process of hiring a PhD students, hopefully a local talents, but we actually have some also international applicants to look into that. And then we are collaborating with different scholars and also looking much deeper into the theoretical arguments of alliance theory, because quite a lot of the work that has been done theoretically on Greenland is coming from the Copenhagen school. And I like Ole Wever and Ulrik Palmgaden, etc. But I think it's a little bit provincial, if I must say, that everybody's using the Copenhagen school to understand what is going on. So we also want to address in a more nuanced way some other theoretical arguments from the alliance argument. So basically, it's a dilemma between economic development and security dimension, where the US by far is the most important ally with the Pituffik space base, etc. And maybe some talks also from both the Greenlandic side and the Danish side that we could see other bases or more involvement from the US, which is making it a little bit weird that the US actually is restating the wish to buy Greenland, because many of the things in terms of just security, they can already do that in many, many ways. And then just one final comment on that. I think we also see from the Greenlandic side that there is a more willingness to also discuss the military means and be open to having military investments, especially if there's dual use and for the benefit of local communities in Greenland. And that's also quite interesting. We saw that in the foreign policy strategy that's been mentioned that came out a year ago, that they're open to some of these things. It's going to be really, really interesting looking forward how some of these dilemmas that Greenland has in terms of independence, who do Greenland wants to have as close partners, because I think that's also a statement from the Greenlandic side that more so than ever, and I think actually Sarah's written a little bit about this, is a clear cut in the Western alliance in some ways, because Greenland has been open to having partners, whoever wants to abide to say the mineral law in Greenland and international order, etc. But Greenland has also been open also to having partners in East Asia, including China, working together with the EU for many decades, etc. So that's going to be very, very interesting. And the one thing that I also try to keep in mind, that there is quite a lot of cheap talk from Trump's side. So there isn't really that Mexican wall that he talked a lot about in the last campaign. And that's some has likened it to he's throwing a dart and then put the bullseye where it's hit and trying to figure out how that kind of fits into his argument, etc., etc. So in many ways, I hope it's cheap talk, because I can understand from my Greenlandic colleagues and from the sentiments in Nuuk, and again, I haven't been home for quite a while, that this is scary time, and it's really difficult to trying to predict front load the future, what is going to happen even in the not too distant future. I think I will close on that remark for now, and I'm open to question in the discussions later. Thanks.
Great, Rasmus, thank you very much. I hope you have been able to evade at least some of the prying journalists from your current retreat there. And again, I think a lot that we'll unpack later in the Q&A. But last but certainly not least, is my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Kristina Spohr, Professor of International History at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Spohr is currently writing a global history of the Arctic and will contribute a broader historical perspective to these proceedings, which I think is certainly very much welcome. So, Professor Spohr, without further ado, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Trevelyan. Thank you for this invite to take part in this. Well, since I'm the last person, I'm not going to come to you with a set piece, but put some of the thoughts I have also in relation to what we have heard forward here. I thought it was very important what was highlighted by Sara, namely the question, if you think of this as a sort of multi-level situation in relation to world order and the regional order and the Greenlandic situation, namely that, you know, we hear that these elections are coming up, and this raises all sorts of questions on self-determination and also what we would call equal sovereignty. And if you think about it in a European context, the Helsinki Final Act, which highlights these kind of things, and also the freedom of choice of alliance, these aspects of agency, especially when we have self-rule, or when we are also looking for applying self-determination to gain independence, is really important in the current context of a time of war here in Europe with wider repercussions. And I think that agency also needs to be seen in the Arctic Council, which we have had since the end of the Cold War, where namely the indigenous peoples have this representation as permanent members, and that is really important in relation to, you know, the state representation here in the Greenlandic case by the sort of colonizing power, Denmark. So we should always remember that for the Arctic region we have the Arctic Council, and that has been, you know, a really hard fought for body where security policy is not discussed, but where in terms of representation the natives have a seat. So that is something I would like to put out here. Then the second point is, of course, that whole relationship, seeking independence versus Denmark, but then also Denmark as a member of NATO, and Denmark also a member of the EU, but Greenland being not in the EU. So this again raises certain tensions, and I will come back to that in a while. But because I said we are in a time of war, and we heard already a little bit about the Ukraine angle and that question of world order. Is this rules-based order holding? This is where I want to come in with Trump, because I think unlike in the past, where we have thought about America as a sort of beacon of holding up the liberal order, we now have a President Trump 2.0 who very effectively in the last 2 weeks has really worked on all sorts of fronts, you know, to really undermine this. And what do I mean? And I want for the moment, for literally just 1 minute, to go quickly into this behavior of Trump, not just vis-a-vis Greenland, but also what we have heard over the last couple of days, because it's actually interlinked if we think of the United States also as a NATO member and what the United States or Trump proposed towards Greenland. He has, you know, said that Ukraine is guilty of starting the war, that Ukraine should hold elections, that the approval rating of Zelensky is 4%, and that in any case, if you think about this as one day after the Russia-American talks, there should be a reorientation, there should be a regime change, and of course, if there if there was any kind of ceasefire and arrangement for Ukraine, then definitely no NATO country monitors of any sorts, no peacekeeping, no whatever. I don't want to dwell on that, but what I want to highlight here is that he's doing everything to put a spanner in the works when it comes to this whole questions of how NATO would function. Why do I bring this up? Because in NATO, Denmark and America are actually allies. And now let's think about what Trump said a few weeks ago with regard to Greenland. Buying Greenland, not just for national security reasons, but also, to have the freedom because there's Chinese ships and Russian ships, and he sort of mixed it all together. Yes, I agree. Buying Greenland is not a new idea, but it is a bit of a different thing if you want to buy something from an ally, number one. And now let's think about this historical side of things. Because in a weird way, although Trump stands for MAGA and something that seems isolationist, then when it comes to Panama, Greenland, Canada, and the Monroe Doctrine, then suddenly it's not that isolationist at all. Suddenly it's about hemispheric thinking. Now, I made that point about Russia earlier, and I just want to show you this map, because this map is of a Russian book by Putin's favorite author. This book tends to lie on his desk. And in this book, which is about a sort of sci-fi idea of Russia as the Third Empire 2054, if you think of the hemispheric map, yes, there is, a huge blue united sort of Northern America and Southern America, but Greenland and the rest of Europe, by the way, is all red, belongs all to Russia. So if you think of Russia as an Arctic power, this may all look very different. And before you know it, you are thinking about all sorts of weird hemispheric thinking. I just want to throw that in the room. But if we now think historically, and we now compare what Trump's purchase ideas have to do with the past or not at all, I just want to remind you that, of course, when the Americans thought of Greenland in the Second World War context, this had to do with extending security from their perspective vis-à-vis the Nazis. It was because the Nazis had occupied Denmark. It wasn't to buy it off Denmark as such, right? So this, if neutrality wasn't enough, then there was that case over US bases and the US Navy redefining the Western Hemisphere. And that included the Azores and the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, yes, and also Greenland, because the American thinking was that one had to prevent Germany from getting, a strangle on Lend-Lease convoys and to stop the Luftwaffe bombing New York and all these kinds of ideas. And of course, the Greenland issue was also tied up with Iceland. So I think that is really quite important. And of course, also in that context, if you think about the scholarly community, there were these sort of new ideas or the concept of geopolitics and geography and the concept of security, in any case, sort of on the agenda. Then sort of after the Second World War, we really look at as a formalization of colony, because if we think about the United Nations, then sort of Denmark tried to present itself as a sort of kind of benevolent colonizer, or benign. And so, that is all very complicated, because then it really gets formalized as something that had already existed for several hundred years before, which then leads us again into this conversation about, the right to self-determination, decolonization, and how do you, pursue this. Now, because we are currently in a situation of crisis in regard to that relationship of what the United States has thrown out there, namely Trump saying, I want to buy this, and he caused everybody to be stunned, not just over Ukraine, but over Greenland for all concerns. There's sort of two weird things, because Greenland has been important for the United States because of the base, because of military strategic thinking, because of the radar stations. Actually, America's had a very good relationship, so, why would you want to buy that place? And what does it mean for NATO if the main ally is now challenging the supposedly smaller ally, however, with a terrain that the bigger ally is interested in? So that raises really awkward tensions, but it also raises actually practical issues of NATO functioning, for example. Since Trump said he would potentially even use force, well, what would that mean for all the other NATO members? What would that mean for Article 5? Because Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, wouldn't work if it's an ally that is actually doing it. So we have a problem here. Then if Denmark would want to resort to the EU under the Treaty of the European Union, the Lisbon Treaty, we would have a problem because since Greenland is not in the EU, and since it's also not an outermost region, but actually, you know, it's a different kind of territory, Denmark would have to, you know, find other ways to get allies interested for some kind of defense again against the United States, who actually under NATO would be an ally. And so even for EU members, it's an awkward situation because some are just in the EU and some are EU and NATO. And on which side would EU NATO members come down, on the American side or the Danish side? So these are all theoretical mind games over a very tenuous, volatile situation. And of course, we are taking away the agency of the Greenlanders themselves, but we cannot get away from the fact that everybody who is involved is part of this really awkward situation of being, to some extent, in the same alliance. And when it comes to the military side, of course, the Greenlanders don't have any materiel or army or navy themselves. So it's all very awkward in that situation between the United States and Denmark and the other NATO countries. And of course, if we think about Arctic, the polar region at large, we see lots of volatility in the situation of the world order moving into this multipolarity, the survival of the strongest, and we see tensions in all sorts of Arctic areas. And by that, I don't mean the various passages. What I mean is, for example, Chinese-Russian cooperation amongst the Coast Guard in the American backyard on the Pacific side, in the Bering Sea area, for example. So there's tension over there. Then we have the question, since we have the Russian Northern Fleet and the missiles in the Kola Peninsula, and we think about the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, submarines, second strike capacities, you know, you would see all sorts of potential theaters for war, and yet I don't want to say that that is what is coming. In fact, I think we should move away from that thinking that it should be ratcheted up in that direction. But what I try to say is, when the President of the United States goes out and throws these comments out that put the whole rules-based order, if you so want, into disarray, in a situation where the Russians broke it in the first place, we have a sort of double whammy, and we have a real serious problem if we think about it from our perspective as European powers. And that is something I would like to sort of throw to you in the room. And then in the discussion, we can talk about, you know, the competition over resources and passages and so forth.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Kristina. That was, again, absolutely brilliant. And again, a lot to delve into there. Before we go into the Q&A with the audience, again, I'm sure you all have many questions. But I first want to go back to one point, and especially put this to our Greenlandic participants. I'm curious to what extent you think the impact of this latest Trump-induced fury has had in shaping the Danish-Icelandic relationship, and of course also the impact on the island's prospective pathway to full self-determination. Of course, this is something that's very much been ongoing, as you both mentioned. But given the nature of this intervention, of course, in Denmark, I mean, speaking to a lot of colleagues in Copenhagen in recent months, there's been this seemingly been the sense that, you know, oh goodness, you know, we should have been giving more attention to Greenlanders and their concerns. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what the broader impacts of this latest episode have been on that front. Whichever one of you wants to jump in first. Sara.
Rasmus, you have to come home and join the, I'm going to joke a little bit, okay? Join the information army up here. We are very tired from the past 2 months of constant talking. But thank you for the question. First of all, I think it's important to compartmentalize the ongoing process, which I would call a decolonial approach emerging from Greenland in terms of the Greenland-Denmark relation, where there is a very strong movement and demand from Kalaallit side, both in the public, the mainstream public, but also on a governmental level, to approach the relationship in a more truthful way with a perspective from here in Gadaslitanat. We see that with the inquiries that are underway. Both the big one, which the government and the two governments have agreed to work on, looking back at the consequences of colonization, not just up until 1953, which is the formal end of colonialism or the colonial era, but also what happened after 53, where much more massive policies, colonial policies, created a systemic discrimination of Inuit and Greenlanders in Greenland and in Denmark, and what those policies and that systemic discrimination has of legacies within the current systems, both here in Gadaslitanat and in Denmark. And those processes are ongoing. There's a broad one, and there's a specific one related to the IUD program, which I'm sure you've heard of, which is a very, very, very serious matter, where a program decided basically by the government in Denmark resulted in half of the women and girls in a childbearing age being fitted with IUDs. And what has been in the sort of the new information that's come out latest is that many of those cases were done without the consent of the women and girls or the consent of the parents of the girls if they were underage. And that is a big case. It has been a matter, a political issue that has, as I see it, basically changed the landscape in terms of looking back at the relationship between Gadaslitanat and Denmark, because it very clearly is an example of a deliberate policy from Denmark after the formal colonial era, at the time where the vote in Denmark, only in Denmark, to change the constitution of Denmark in 53, from a Danish perspective, had the aim of creating an equal status for Greenland. The opposite happened. So Greenland, first of all, never voted for that constitution, and there was no such thing as an equal status. On the contrary, there was one program after the other that was extremely discriminatory. So that era is being investigated by Greenland and Denmark, decided upon by the governments, and the IOD program is being investigated in also a Greenlandic Danish inquiry. And on top of that, the government of Greenland has decided also to do their own investigation of the human rights aspects of the IOD program. So both the individual and collective human rights aspects. And you have to understand, I think, that's a process that would have been going on regardless of what a President Trump says. And the pressure from the people of Greenland to look at the colonial history with different eyes than what we've seen from the Danish side, and the demand of that is massive. And it hasn't as such come out. It hasn't happened because of a US president, not because of 2019, not because of anything happening later. So you have to compartmentalize those things. What happened, so January 7th, you know, that's when our phones started ringing, Rasmus. I was at the university those weeks and running basically, or literally running from office to ask, you know, other colleagues that didn't necessarily do research on the areas that Rasmus and I do, to ask, can you please just talk with these reporters and inform them of what kind of society is Greenland? What is our history? And prevent, hopefully, a lot of the misinformation that also came after January 7th. And that's, of course, when the plane landed with the so-called tourist. So of course, that has had an impact. But the immediate response that came from the 5 party leaders, which I noted, was that it didn't bring Greenland closer to the US. On the contrary, it made it clearer that Greenland is is a part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And it also forced the same 5 party leaders to reply media. And this is what was then reported. I haven't asked the 5 party leaders myself, but reported in media, they clearly all said that they don't see a future for Greenland where Greenland would choose the US over Denmark in a future relationship, whatever that relationship would be. So at the immediate response, I would say brought Greenland and Denmark closer, but with a very clear position in Greenland that regardless of this re-emerged attention, the necessary processes in terms of a truth process between Greenland and Denmark in terms of what you would in other places maybe call truth and reconciliation. So having that truth process was not being questioned. It was not being changed in any way by that new re-emerged attention. So you have to compartmentalize those things. In the recent days media, I do note that now there's 6 parties, 5 of them and 4 of them that are currently in the parliament are clear on supporting the new message or the new decisions and policies presented by Denmark on defense, increase of spendings on defense, mostly, of course, on the already decided issues, which are about surveillance and response and preparedness. And then there's one party that is saying something different. And that one party has also previously, when they were in government, floated ideas of replacing the military presence in Greenland with US military presence. And I saw in the news today that that's what they are saying again. I think, again, in terms of those kinds of messaging, they should be taken not out of context. I still think that the big context is that the already existing movement towards independence in a new form of relationship, with Denmark is the main movement. And it's a couple of decades ago that I think the first time questions were asked if it necessarily had to be Denmark. And I think that we can see in the future discussions about, for example, a different kind of a Nordic union or a different kind of alliancing with other Nordic states. But it doesn't right now look as if that anybody is wanting to replace such a relationship with a new relationship with the US. So that's the current status, I would say, from following the media closely here.
Great, no, thank you very much. And Rasmus, I'm going to come to you in just one second. But again, Sara, you've picked up on something. Actually, this is great because you've jumped to my third question here. And I mean, of course, Kristina before mentioned this this narrative that Denmark had previously been pushing of Denmark as benevolent colonizer, which of course Greenlanders themselves never accepted, and has been further contravened, as you mentioned, by the IUD issue, by other issues, new revelations of historic and systemic abuse by the Danish administration and state in Greenland. But of course, you said there that a lot of these discussions, were ongoing and would have come about in any case, certainly from the Greenlandic side. But of course, on the Danish side, there's been some interesting timing here, right? I think it was after you mentioned with the tourists. For those of you who don't know, Donald Trump's son visited Greenland. My understanding is that there wasn't actually that much interest. I think to fill out people at a lunch, they had to pull people off the street and offer them a free lunch. But of course, the point there being that it wasn't long after, again, this latest episode of, we could say, awareness raising, I suppose, by Donald Trump, that the Danish Royal Coat of Arms was changed to give Greenland a greater prominence, that a renewed focus in terms of government policy in Denmark was placed on, again, furthering some of these truth processes that you mentioned. I'm curious then to the latter point of my original question. Again, this is, Rasmus, feel free to take this forward too, but Sara, I welcome any further interventions from you. Whether you think that this has pushed along further, perhaps, that process toward, from many Greenlanders' perspectives, the inevitable, direction towards full self-determination.
Do you want to say something about that, Rasmus, or should I just quickly say, again, I don't think that the underlying current has changed. And with the direction in terms of independence in the future has been there since we voted in 2008, November 2008. I recently found the letter. I was studying anthropology in Copenhagen at that time, and I had to apply to vote because I lived outside of Galatnat, and it was very important for us. There was the biggest turnout in that referendum on self-determination in terms of voting on the self-government agreement, and that included the paragraph 21 and the choice of the people of Greenland to declare independence upon a referendum and to initiate that process. So the underlying current, I don't think has changed. But yes, I do think that the Danish response has changed. And then it's changed again now within the past 2 weeks because of a documentary that was today retracted, which spoke about some of the economic relations between Greenland and Denmark. But basically, that's also issues that should be viewed with a more decolonial approach, looking to how you understand economic relations between colonies and colonizers in other places in the world. And that's really difficult for the Danes.
Great, thank you. Rasmus.
So in my talk, I mentioned that Sara and I did a piece on the first Trump wanna buy Greenland ordeal. And in that piece, we quoted editor-in-chief from one of the local newspapers saying, this is a wake-up call. And I think one of the very few places from the Danish side you can actually see there is progress is within the Ministry of Defense. They have been, and that's coming from a very low level, that they just went prior to this to do press releases of now we're going to invest in this, in that. So I think in that sense, you can see some progress from the Danish side within one of the ministry, one of the important ministries. But also the documentary that Sara just mentioned with the Krylit mine that Professor Powell mentioned has also been showcasing that they're just really talking about very different things. And it showcases that some of the Danish politicians and also fairly high-ranking Danish politicians either haven't really read the Self-Rule Act or don't understand the process how self-determination works. I think that the Prime Minister of Denmark have been very clear also back in 2019 that it's up to the Greenlandic people and Naalakkersuisut to decide if and when they want a referendum of independence of some sort. Turning into, again, trying to, what I hope could come out of this is that we need to do something about the status quo within the Kingdom of Denmark. Neither Greenland nor the Faroe Islands is particularly happy about the status quo, and what could happen is, and I think from a Danish side, often I've talked to people in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs that they don't have a whole section looking into what could a free association model look like, because they can't put money into diplomats working on something that's quite hypothetical, so they won't look into something that is not very tangible in terms of what the Greenlandic and also what the Faroese want. But I really hope that we can do something about changing the status quo. And I don't have really any strong opinion whether this should be a federalist model. We could look to Switzerland, Canada, etc., and not take a one-fit-all model. But there are some really interesting bits and pieces in federalist theory and models around the world. Or it should be a free association, because no one in Greenland is really talking about a North Korean style independence, but having no friends whatsoever. Not even, I mean, Pelle Broberg from LRA has been very clear on that many, many times. And I think that gets misconstrued from some of the Danish politicians and also some Danish academics that are misunderstanding what the Greenlandic voice actually is. And it is basically about equality. And that's also some of the discussion about that documentary that we drawn today is showcasing how sometimes how far away on different playing field we are discussing within the Kingdom of Denmark. So that was a chance to discuss some of the colonial past and some of the solutions and economic issues of the past and the future. And now that was a dead end apparently because people got sacked in the Danish broadcasting news and withdrawn from that. But I do think that we really need to have a discussion. I don't know if it's going to be a committee, because I can't really see anybody who who has a foolproof plan of what could happen. So we need to discuss that. But there is a lot of berøringsangst in Danish. So it's like Denmark is very hesitant to discuss something that's been taken home from the Greenlandic side because they get into trouble. So where's the tipping point between when is this a Greenlandic thing or a Danish thing? And some of it is really, really messy and difficult to really pan out. What is it? But I do hope we can find a way to do something about a status quo. Whether that is Greenland looking at, could also be Canada. Canada made a joke that it could be that could be a solution rather than the US or Denmark. But we need to address something different than the status quo. And I do hope, and maybe that's a tad naive, that this could spur a discussion. What could be the next phase? Because no one is really happy in this arrangement that we had as of now. Thanks.
Great, Rasmus, thank you very much. I do have more questions, but I do realize that we have a full audience, raring to go here. If you have a question, please raise your hand. There is someone with a roving microphone at the end. Please wait for the microphone to come to you before asking your question. And please introduce yourself first so our speakers know who they are hearing from. So there's one question at the back, two questions at the back right there. First, the gentleman in, yeah, sure. First, yes, there we go. Thank you.
Thank you. Boris Kashnikov, Polis. Suppose at a certain moment the people of Greenland take a fancy to join the United States, or Denmark runs out of money. Will the purchase be possible, technically or legally, at all?
Right. And was there a particular person that you want to direct that question to our entire panel?
Oh, anyone who can answer.
Thank you very much. And then I'm just at the same time going to take the question right in front of you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'm a fifth student of Cambridge in Politics and International Studies. I'm Ming Xuan Yang. And I want to ask a question. Of course, I sincerely believe that Greenland people deserve the right to self-determination and decolonization. But I have some concern about the future once Greenland get independent. Well, if Greenland become an independent nation, it will become one of the largest nations of the world in terms of its territory, but one of the smallest nations in the world in terms of its population. So how could Greenland really work like a sustainable solution to defend its security and to maintain its relations with its neighbors like a peaceful and a kind of constructive way, and within the kind of power struggles between great powers and big nations? And maybe Greenland has to, rejoin like the NATO and to find out a solution without Denmark's help to defend itself. So I want to know what kind of approach could be a kind of constructive and viable approach for the independence. Or you think if it's possible? Yeah.
Great, thank you. We'll take those two questions first and then come back for another round. Who would like to jump in? Again, anyone from our panel. Perhaps one of our virtual speakers first.
I can start. So I did. The first question was I didn't hear all of it, but what I think was asked was, how is this legally possible? So the Self-Rule Act is quite clear that Greenland can have a referendum and be independent whenever it wants. So that was also what we discussed 5 years ago with the first Trump wants to buy Greenland or deal. That is not for Denmark to sell Greenland. Greenland self-determination, they can have a referendum, decide to become independent, then make a new model if they want to do that. So legal, that's quite clear-cut. Then in terms of defending itself, there has been discussions over time that Greenland wants to be part of NATO also as an independent country, and maybe looking especially towards the Icelandic model of not having a standing army, but having a coast guard, etc., etc. But also some of the models that we could envision happening could be a free association or something that the defense is still outsourced to the US or to Denmark or a mix. We could also envision that a free association with some things going in collaborating with Denmark and sometimes with the US. That could be very, very complicated, but I have been hearing Greenlandic diplomats toying with that idea of something that could happen. The argument you often hear is that Greenland can be independent for more than 15 minutes, then either China, Russia, and the US will be on the shore. But that's not really what we're discussing, because that has to be part of the model of outsourcing or taking care of what model defense policy is going to entail of some sort of an independent Greenland, whatever model is chosen. And that model is not really that clear from the Greenlandic politician. There was a draft constitution coming out a few years ago. We were hoping a more tangible discussion was going to feed off of that draft constitution. And that didn't really happen to that much of a agree. I don't know if Sarah is disagree that she was part of the process in much more into that discussion than I was at the time. So I'm basically just an academic criticizing the process in that term. But in terms of both legality, that's quite clear-cut, and also in terms of defense, I would say that's quite clear-cut as well.
Great, Rasmus, thank you very much. Sarah, over to you, perhaps. So again, the two questions: one on how this would actually happen for Greenland to be, if Greenland were to be, I guess, bought by the US or whoever else. But then, of course, the other question about Greenlandic self-determination, if Greenland were to become an independent country, it being, again, one of the largest in terms of territory, one of the smallest in terms of population, and how that would be managed. So again, over to you, Sarah.
Yes, I mean, first of all, I think that the Greenland is, that theoretically speaking, Greenland wouldn't be the only nation in the world, independent nation in the world with a small population. That also exists other places. And as Rasmus said, I don't think that anyone in Greenland imagines or doesn't know and doesn't take into account in the discussions that 57,000 inhabitants, we cannot all be soldiers. We cannot all, be drafted into an army. So there is a very sort of pragmatic and realistic approach and knowledge, I would say, seen from within, in terms of knowing that there's a need to build alliances. And the big question is, does those alliances look different from now? The simple question right now is no. The biggest question is, where is the US and where will the US be in the future? Because Greenland has already mentioned and said clearly that Greenland sees itself as part of the Western Alliance, the NATO alliance. That happened quite clearly also latest in 2022. When Greenland joined the Western Alliance's sanctions after the invasion of Ukraine. And of course, that's the line that the politicians in Greenland generally have. There's no one who doesn't have that line or that approach. So the big question is, where do we have NATO in the future? Where do we have the US in the future? And that's back to the big question that both Professor Spohr and myself asked in terms of the future of the international rules-based order and also the future of NATO. So I think that's a question that we need to of course, everybody, we've just seen the Munich Security Conference and what came out of there. So, it's just very, very important that we don't see the situation of Greenland as something detached from the greater international development. It's a part of that development with the same basically the same driver of how that develops right now. So that's, I think, is an important thing. As it's already been mentioned by Rasmus, the self-government agreement is very clear in terms of what process will be ahead of us. The paragraph 21 that everybody refers to, and that which the parliament in this now ending term, 4-year term, has decided to some extent to activate, is a very natural part of the development. I think the biggest question is the biggest issue in terms of how the self-government agreement and acts and its paragraphs are understood in between Greenland and Denmark is basically what I've said before, that the Danes seem to have put that document in the drawer and not really, taken given it a lot of attention since it was inaugurated in 2009, whereas in Greenland, it's been a work plan. And that work plan has been followed. So there's been like a detachment in the development and perception of what the Self-Government Act is in between Greenland and Denmark. And that might also have been part of what has sparked this current rhetoric that we are hearing from the US. And if the incentive from the US has been to get rid of a blurred situation of who controls Greenland, this strategy has worked. But it's at the same time an extremely concerning strategy because we see it on a global and a larger scale than just Greenland. So I think that is what raises the extreme concern in terms of how the people of Greenland and the nation of Greenland will be treated in the future.
Great. Sara, thank you very much. I know Kristina wants to jump in here.
I just want to say a brief comment. I mean, I think we also have to remember, you just have to think also about the environment and the harshness of the climate and the conditions of the sea. It's not like, you know, suddenly everybody's rocking up on Greenland's coast and trying to invade a place where, you know, the different communities and towns are not connected by roads. I mean, you know, every town is at the end of a fjord. I mean, you have to think of those realities and also of the realities when we talk about these. For example, the Northwest Passage, nobody's going to come around there, you know, in a hurry. But I think if somebody wants to make real mischief to Greenland, then it's a question of communications, which is something we have also seen in the Baltic Sea. You have to think of the underwater cables, the cables connected to the United States and to Canada. And that would be, for example, damaging for Greenland's functioning. So I think there's those kind of new things we need to consider when we talk about security politics beyond what I addressed before.
Great, thank you very much. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I mean, I'm happy to take. I basically agree with what's been said. I think.
Great. Excellent. Right. Good. Well, again, 3 questions here. If we have perhaps was that a 4th question? Okay, well, I'm going to take them as a group. So let's have the gentleman there in the pink. Yes. And again, please introduce yourself first and try to keep it brief, please. We want to get as many questions in as possible.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Bogdan, and I'm a student here in Cambridge. So as a non-specialist, I look into this discussion as it turns around constantly only around one person, who is a Trump. And for me, it makes some implicit perception that it's just a will of one person. So in this regard, how we treat other American politicians, whether this idea of need to purchase Greenland is well accepted among other American politicians, or is just a will of one person?
Okay, thank you very much. The next question, the lady here.
So my name is Milena, and I'm a PhD student here at the university in an unrelated field, as well as a volunteer at the Polar Museum. And I have 2 quite related questions. Firstly, the US already has military bases in Greenland. They have some commercial interests there. What do you think they expect to change when it comes to their business in Greenland, if they intend to purchase it? So what do they want to gain, essentially? And perhaps a question especially to Sara, as someone involved in Greenlandic politics. Have there been any more detailed pronouncements from the side of the US how the sort of purchasing of Greenland, or making in the next state, would work, how it would impact the self-government, the self-rule, and so forth?
Great, thank you very much. And then the next question, can you raise your hand if you, yes, the gentleman there in the blazer right at the end, yes?
Yes, my name is Bjarne Mørum, and I'm one of those dreaded journalists, the UK correspondent for the Danish daily Kristeligt Dagblad. This is mainly for Kristina, I think. How likely is it, with all those balloons that Mr. Trump is sending up in the air, that the Greenland question will go away, or will he be persevering with it?
Great. I actually especially appreciate that, because there's balloons in the air that literally delayed our train earlier. Another question, the gentleman here in the front, I believe, had one.
So I've quite a lot actually, yeah, okay. So some background. I'm a Norwegian master student here in history at the University of Cambridge. I'm probably one of the few people here that's actually lived in Cambridge. I was living and working for Royal Greenland a couple of years back.
I lived in Greenland.
Yeah. So I love Greenland quite a lot. This is really fascinating to me to see how it kind of comes up in the media now in a different kind of fashion than what I'm used to. I think I have more a question directed to Sara and Rasmus concerning the kind of. So you're speaking about walking a fine line between like independence on one hand, the connections to Denmark or Scandinavia or whatnot, and on the other hand, having this kind of new resurgent kind of discussion about American control over Greenland. I would like to hear some of you guys' thoughts on the general kind of system as it works right now, because now, of course, Scandinavians can travel to Greenland, work there, live there, study for free. The same goes for Greenlandic people. They can travel to Norway or Denmark, work and study. And these are kind of privileges that we take for granted right now, but would likely to come under threat if the status quo changes drastically. Another example would be fisheries quotas, where, for example, Greenlandic vessels, they fish in Norwegian waters, important for the Greenlandic economy. But if Greenland would move in a more American-centered direction, how do you think the prospect of maintaining these relations would be, especially considering that Europe is kind of closing in on itself a bit in response to the kind of American aggression that we see as right now? I find it kind of hard to see that, let's say, Norway would kind of give beneficial quotas to Greenlandic fisheries if we see it in the sense that Greenland is kind of turning away from kind of connected relations that we've had up until this point so far. So some general thought on kind of like the benefits of the system as it exists right now.
Great, thank you very much. And again, this is the final round of questions. And I realize there's one gentleman at the end there that had a question, I believe, as well. Is that correct? Yes. He's raised his hand there. Yes.
Hi, Colin Barnes from Wolfson College, Cambridge. My question is, well, I'll keep it short. Greenland, as you mentioned earlier, is very important for the exploitation of rare earths, which is an area I worked on in China. And China has an interest in exploiting rare earths in Greenland, and I think also possibly Australia. They've set up a joint venture. My question would be, China will, if it mines the rare earths, it's got to move them off the country, it's got to export them, which means that they have ships, Chinese ships will come up to Greenland to take this material away. If so, they may want to build or develop a deep water port. What would the American reaction be to that? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I think we'll go in reverse order there, if that's all right. The last question, again, on Chinese interests in rare earths in particular. Of course, Rasmus mentioned before that the US has been quite effective at keeping China out of Greenland in many different respects. But again, Rasmus, would you like to take this question on how that would actually work? You know, if the Chinese were to gain more of a foothold, say if Greenland were to become fully self-governing, would they want to build sort of port infrastructure and other types of infrastructure around that? And how might the U.S. react to that? Rasmus.
So there's been rumors for maybe 5 years that the U.S., I think it came out of some debates, congressional debates some years ago, that maybe the U.S. wanted to invest in a deep water port, and some of these discussions I've heard them recently. I forget the context of those. So those rumors been floating around for some years. That is something that the U.S. could be interested in, but it's not really tangible at the moment, at least not to my knowledge. That is something that could happen. There's been discussion, where should it be? Should it be in southern Greenland, in Sisimiut, etc., etc. So this idea has happened, and there are other mining projects that at some point had Chinese involvement, but they are now out of them, also with some others, Australian companies up in Citronfjorden, further, like way up north in the national park of Greenland. And I'm just going to very briefly mention some of the other questions that the former questions was about what would happen in terms of the status quo. So it's quite important, and that's also feedback to the alliance dilemma that I mentioned in my own presentation, that the exports to the US is very, very little. There's a little bit of snow crab being exported from Royal Greenland, as you might know from your time in there. In terms of students, we have some of our own students is following a Fulbright program, which is quite cool that we have several Greenlandic PhD students taking part of that prestigious project. We have barely a dozen exchange students at the university every year, but they mainly come through the Erasmus Plus, so European from France, Finland, etc. We had a few Canadians. I can't really remember if we had any Americans, not as far as I recall in terms of that. And then just a brief comment on the first questions about only one. So in the introductory comments, everybody was talking about some of the historical past of going back. So Trump is not the first one. But I do want to give an observation. I was in Washington, D.C. for roughly a month a couple of years ago. And what struck me was that there are people that are extremely smart on the Greenlandic and Arctic questions. You have people in the Wilson Center and the Ted Stevens Center in Alaska that knows a lot, but you have a lot of think tanks that can hardly spell Greenland, that doesn't know that much about Arctic stuff. And so it depends on who is going to whisper to Trump how we are going to solve this. There's a lot of people in the US, also in DC, that hardly know anything about what is going on some of the both formal and normative and practical and security issue that is going on in that sense. So I won't say that the US is not just one person, but it's neither a unitary actor that is deciding what is going to happen to Greenland, what they're going to that. And again, they can't just buy Greenland flat like they did in Alaska in the past. But it's I get some really mixed signals from the US in terms of also what they know about it, because we have some collaborating partners in the US that are really smart and really wants to learn and do more collaboration in the North American Arctic, as some of the workshops we've been doing collaborating on in the past. But there's also quite a lot of people who are not in the know about some of these issues. So it's very dependent on who you talk to. So not just one, but not a unitary actor.
Great. Thank you very much. So that's questions 1 and 5 taken care of. Sarah, if I could bring you in here to address question 4 first from our Norwegian friend who himself spent time in Greenland about the Nordic element. If Greenland were to go its own way, how do you see that dynamic playing out? In particular was mentioned sort of exchange students coming to Greenland, of course fisheries as well, Greenlanders fishing in Norwegian waters. And then the other question, Sarah, which was also directed at you, what the US would expect to gain were Greenland to choose to become a US state, because again, of course, the theme here is that it is up to Greenlanders to decide, of course, this. So Sarah, I will put both of these questions to you, if I may.
Maybe if I take the last question first, I think that's a very unlikely scenario that Greenland, by its own free will, based on the freedoms that Greenland has negotiated itself to achieve through the Self-Government Act and the long-standing relationship with Denmark, would choose to become a part of the US. That is not what I'm hearing from any of the parties in this quite living, or what do you call it? It's a very, very right now ongoing, very vivid election campaigns. And I think one thing to remember is that the current Greenlandic system, the system we have here, based on the self-government achieved since 1979, is a continuation of the Nordic welfare model. So that's what we are used to. We are used to free school, free universities, free medication, free doctors. We're used to the support through the welfare system, the social support. there's a lot of challenges, and the numbers are grave in terms of homelessness and other issues related to social affairs. A lot of it, I would say, is also because of the colonial legacy, that there's a need to focus on in a different way than we've seen. But the basic sort of point of departure is that it is a Nordic welfare model that has been implemented in Greenland, both before 1979, but definitely also continued after Greenland obtained home rule in 1979 and later self-government. And I don't see any movements away from a Nordic welfare model. And I think that in itself, as I see it on social media and in the debates, is something that people are looking to and holding on to in terms of the debate on a future relationship with the US. When that is said, as I mentioned, the development we've seen from 2014 until the current years, so the latest years, with a movement towards more specific memoranda of understandings with the US on energy and mineral resource development, on more specific dialogue and direct dialogue with the US on possible investments in Greenland from the US side, as apart from Greenland searching for expanded markets in the US for especially the fish products, as Rasmus is saying, there has also been a movement towards, and that's also expressed in the reply from 2019 and in 2025, that Greenland is open for business, but not for sale. So, but of course, as we all know, there are no free lunches. So how does that business in the future, business cooperation and business relationship look in the future? And I would guess that the current administrations in both Greenland, Denmark, and the US are working on a more quiet dialogue on understanding from each other exactly what does it mean when we talk about an increased business relationship. If we look at the MOUs from 2019, there's a very specific focus on mineral resources, and the critical energy transition minerals, yes, they are a big part of that. But I also think that there's a high degree of awareness, and we saw that in the hearing that was aired publicly from I believe it was the Congress, the hearing initiated by Ted Cruz in the US Congress with a number of experts in the panel. We saw that array of different levels of knowledge, and those more knowledgeable were pointing to the costs of investments if you're opening new mines and new mineral resource projects in Greenland, and that is a well-known fact. So again, I think my guess would be that there is a quite thorough dialogue ongoing to better understand each of the different parties' expectations when they're saying they either want to buy Greenland or they want to do business with the US, increased business with the US. I think the hearing was interesting to listen to, of course, because it also gave some insights to some of the people in the US political machineries thinking about the latest sort of expressions coming out of President Trump. I do want to remind also that, yes, Greenland is not a member of the EU, but Greenland is an overseas country and territory and has a relationship with the EU through that status. And that the EU has opened a representation or an office here in Greenland that we do see as part of the small foreign diplomatic corps here in Nuuk. Besides the US consulate, there's an Icelandic consulate, and there's an EU office, and then there's a large number of honorary consuls. Did I forget any of the real consuls? I don't believe so. Canada is now announcing in their new strategy that they also want to open an actual consulate and not just have an honorary consul. So there's a developing diplomatic environment in Greenland, and I think that is the same incentive from everyone, and that is to do business with Greenland mostly on the critical energy transition minerals, possibly also on other forms of export of energy, if it's going to be possible to export, for example, from hydropower, which is a big theme for the current government and probably also for the next government. For the specific mine in South Greenland, I would say that the municipal election last time resulted in 70% of the local population voting for the one party that unequivocally said no to the mine. So that's a really difficult project for anyone. I wouldn't say that even with a big change in the composition of the parliament that there would necessarily be a change to the current reintroduced zero tolerance towards uranium, especially if the parliament will respect the local community's voice. But I think it's important to say that what we hear from the government of Greenland is that Greenland does want to be a mining nation, and that there are other deposits than the ones that have a high background radiation from uranium in them. So I don't know if that all replies everything on the U.S. basing. Yes, I think that there's also an underlying incentive from the U.S. to increase its basing rights in Greenland for a future access to increased basing in Greenland. And I think that's something I've written about in a couple of research articles pointing to both the mineral resources but also access to basing rights as being part of the incentive of the U.S. building further and more direct relationships with Greenland.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. Before we finally go to Bjarne's question for Kristina, I just want to give Richard the opportunity to jump in here and address.
I agree with what's been said. I guess the only thing I would add is really about the, Trump and what is it for? I mean, it's difficult. Like, clearly, Trump is not a reader, and he's not a particularly, someone's told him about the national security dimensions of Greenland, and, so the idea, like, it's not a ground, like, as we, saw the congressman talking about maps of red, white, and blue land and things, that there's clearly an element to this that is about theatre, but at the same time, there's always been a long-term military, strategic, economic interest. And it needs to really be seen, I think, in the wide... So there's maybe a Trump sort of just classic real estate sort of, maybe he gets to build a hotel there, or maybe Trump Jr., I'm sure that's part of his thinking, like he said about many other parts of the world in the past couple of weeks. But at the same time, there's a real... there's a question about just disruption, and is this partly about, it does mean the end of NATO, and that's also what's being catalyzed with the discussions around Ukraine and things. So I think, as well as the immediate kind of discussion of resources and the long-term discussion about defence and security, which are always there and have always been there. And then there's also, this also needs to be seen in a sort of Trumpian context of this is Trump 2.0, the kind of, the people like Kelly and things from the first administration who always were the grown-ups left in Washington. None of those people are around. Like look at the kinds of people who are in the administration. So the serious conversations, where are they happening outside of the rapidly diminishing federal administration? I guess that's the scary part of this.
Great, thank you very much. And finally, the question directed to you, Kristina.
I link up maybe one and the question posed to me about Trump and the soul man, and then what is he throwing in there? What kind of trial balloons? Well, I think we have to see that here's a president who writes these exec orders. We know that there's sort of in the background, of course, has been lots of work for several years with the Heritage Foundation 2025, and all this let's say there's a sort of hard backbone to some of the things that Trump throws in there, but I think we cannot get away from the fact that when the US president makes the statements, people pay attention, and whether the defense secretary or the state secretary sort of say different things or go in other directions is neither here nor there. At the end, it's Trump who sits at the table and makes a noise. And so I think we have to pay attention what he says and how he behaves at the negotiation table. I would completely agree with what Rasmus said, that there is a whole bunch of very good and across the also political spectrum thinkers and researchers in the United States. I spent last year at the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center, so I also got this whole atmospherics in the run-up to the election of Trump. But I also got a chance to go to Anchorage and talk to the defense people there, the people from the Air Force Base, and then I went to a few tiny communities, mostly native communities by the Bering Sea and Bering Straits, notably Tela and Kotzebue. And why do I mention this? Because I think something really important got said by Sara, that yes, of course, if we think of Siberian Yupik, if we think of the Inupiaq in northwest Alaska and the relations and the connection as a peoples with the Inuit, the Greenlanders, the way they live is completely different. When you go to Greenland, it is really a Nordic welfare state model, and when you go to these tiny hamlets, which are also struggling with the the sea rising and the subsistence hunting and really very little amenities, terrible schooling, and of course also if you think how remote and how far it is from the lower 49. You see that in terms of, they are as a community completely each and every one of them isolated. And it is a struggle for survival also against the oil industry and of course with the Trump administration, no interest whatsoever in environmental concerns, which I think is quite different when we look at these debates inside Greenland and for example, mineral mining and rare earth mining, and how that I imagine would be handled. But to come to your question, I think Trump is obsessed about Greenland not just as this real estates idea, as has been put here, with which I agree. There's always a hotel to be built or some business to be had and some deal to be made, whether it's Gaza on the sea or whether it's Greenland. But I think there's something else. There's also this complete obsession with economic competition and geopolitical or geostrategic competition with China. And the fact that China ever had any interest in deep sea ports and rare earths and uranium and had looked to Greenland, that is stuck in Trump's mind. And that's why he talks also about China ships and Russia ships. I mean, these are all these funny phrases that are sort of Twitterable, if you so want. But I think there's sort of weird obsession about it. And that's why I do think it will not go away. And I think that's why also it is dangerous.
Well, what a note to end on. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a wrap. Thank you very much, Kuyanak, Sara Olsvig, for calling in from Kalafi Nunat from Greenland, Dr. Rasmus Leon Nielsen calling in from Albania, but again, a fellow Greenlander, of course, Professor Spohr from the London School of Economics, and our very own Professor Powell from the Scott Polar Research Institute. Thank you to our audience for being so patient and for bringing such great questions to the fore. You may now be rewarded with drinks just outside. Again, please join me in giving a very big round of applause to our entire panel, both in Cambridge and virtually.